Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. Now, it's been suggested that I should embed a map along with the list of museums I visited. So starting off with the Scandinavian ones, I'm adding a new block into this particular web page. There's obviously a whole load you can choose from, but I'm going to go with a blank block, so the map will always be at the bottom of the list. And then I'm going to go with embed, and then you can see, so go into the edit function, and I've already created a map in Google Maps which has multiple points in it. So I go into the embed data, type in the code or copy the code in, and just like that the map appears. Now, of course, there are some restrictions to this. The map that you can embed directly as a Squarespace element only has one pin, which is obviously designed to show a business location. If you want a multiple pin map, then you have to do it this way, and as you saw, dragging the box doesn't change the size of that, but you can just go into the embed code and set the iframe measures somewhat differently. But then once I've saved it, there you go. As you can see, all of the places I visited I've marked up here on this map, so you can zoom in on Stockholm and see the 3 different museums, and zoom out again, and obviously as I build up this page I'll add more markers. Nice and simple. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. So hello everybody. This is not actually the Friday video I planned to make originally, but that one just gets displaced to a couple of weeks down the line, no big deal. No, specifically what we're going to talk about today is instead something that came up in the comments section of the second video I've done on the career of Admiral Spruance, covering his time from the Battle of Midway to Operation Galvanic, the invasion of Macon and Tarawa. Specifically, of course, during the video I've talked a lot about what Spruance was doing during Midway, somewhat unsurprisingly, but also giving him a fair degree of credit for how Midway turned out, at least as much as you can give credit for the way Midway turned out to the admirals in charge of the ships, because ultimately, at the end of the day, the pilots hundreds of miles away from their carriers are the ones who ended up dropping those bombs. But the admirals and their staffs were the people who put them in that position in the first place, but those kind of divisions are really a bit semantical. Now, the objection that a number of you had in the comments, which is fair, is that on the surface at least it seems to write out poor old Admiral Fletcher, who undeservedly gets a lot of stick anyway, both for Midway and other things, which I actually agree with a fair number of you that, yeah, Fletcher does get an unfair amount of stick and should be remembered a lot better than he is in some works. But then, of course, the question arises, especially given the context of the video, where does the credit for the Battle of Midway's victory lie? Is it Spruance's? Is it Fletcher's? Is it even Nimitz's? And why did I portray Midway in brief the way that I did in the video? So let's go through a few of the reasons and factors involved. Well, firstly, of course, this was not a video which was exclusively about the Battle of Midway. This was not an attempt to tell the entire story of the Battle of Midway. For one thing, obviously, we've had a couple of Midway-related videos with John Partial, which have gone on for considerably longer about Midway, but also, as I've said before, covering something big and important like Midway that has been covered oh so many times before is something that I only really want to do once I feel I can offer something additional to some of the other excellent Midway documentaries out there, rather than just being, this is just Drax saying pretty much the same thing. So given that about 15 minutes or so of the video was directly concerning the Battle of Midway, there are going to be a lot of things that have to be abbreviated or skipped. Secondly, of course, this is a video about Admiral Spruance, the Wednesday video in question. And so essentially what I'm doing is mostly telling the story of Midway from Spruance's view. Hence why, amongst other things, I didn't go into huge amounts of detail about what the pilots of the dive bombers and torpedo bombers were experiencing over the Japanese fleet, because Spruance didn't experience that. He was obviously aboard Enterprise, so he saw the preparations for the launch and the recovery of the aircraft. But what happened once those aircraft were out and about was only really something he could experience via a few scattered radio reports and then the debriefing of the pilots once they got back. Likewise, of course, I didn't cover the 2 attacks on Yorktown by a Japanese aircraft and its subsequent loss to a Japanese submarine, or the heroic damage control efforts in between those attacks, or really much of what Yorktown was doing at all, unless it directly impacted what Task Force 16 was doing, because again, as far as Spruance was concerned, he didn't really know all that much. If Yorktown dispatched search aircraft, he would know about that because he'd be told and he could see them. If Yorktown was hit, well, he saw that, or at least he saw the big columns of smoke coming up from Yorktown, but he wasn't there to experience what Admiral Fletcher and the crew of Yorktown were experiencing, and hence, of course, that didn't get covered all that much. In fact, you'll notice I didn't actually cover the final loss of Yorktown at all, because, once again, it's not, strictly speaking, directly relevant to Spruance's story, as compared to some of the other details. Now, with all of that in mind, we have to address essentially what I've gleaned to be the 3 main objections, which are who came up with the plans, who was responsible for those plans being executed, and who was in overall command for the bulk of the Battle of Midway. Now, as I said, several of you raised these issues in the comments. I'd like to particularly mention Jet Driver, who was one of the first to mention them, but also, was incredibly polite and civilized with a very extensive discussion, at least as far as YouTube comments go, running into a couple of pages worth of text between me and him. So, generally, to most of you, thank you for raising it, but also particular thanks to Jet Driver for the rather nice exchange of views. It's the kind of exchange I encourage. So let's start off with who came up with the plans for Midway. Now, obviously, you have layers of command going on, and this is also going to be relevant for some of the other elements. Of course, right up at the very top of the pecking order, you have the President and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, particularly Admirals Lee and King. Below that, you have Admiral Nimitz, who is in charge of the Central and Southern Pacific areas. Obviously, MacArthur's off in the Southwest Pacific doing his thing. And then below that, you have Task Force 16 and Task Force 17. 16 being Enterprise and Hornet under Spruance, and 17 being under Fletcher. Now, in that last layer of command, you also have the fact that Fletcher, at the time of the start of the Battle of Midway, is not only in command of Task Force 17, he is also in command of the US fleet that's present as a whole. So he actually occupies 2 roles, in a way, one of which is equivalent to Spruance. You could even potentially argue that given that Spruance has the larger force of 2 carriers compared to Fletcher's 1, technically speaking, it could be an inferior position, at least by measure of strength, before you get into seniority and all that other nonsense. But, regardless of all that, Fletcher is actually also in overall command. Now, of course, Nimitz has issued a series of orders and, if you like, general plans for how the battle is to go about. Restrictions on what they can't do, encouragement on what they should do, etc., etc. However, Nimitz was actually rather explicit in both oral records and in written orders that he did not want to unduly constrain what Spruance and Fletcher were capable of doing and how they should conduct the battle, because, frankly, Nimitz was not an idiot, and he knew that trying to micromanage the battle, which was already a battle with some concerns about how it would go, was a fool's task, especially if he's doing it from all the way back in Pearl Harbor. Bearing in mind, as was mentioned in the video, Spruance actually had explicit orders that if things went really badly, he was actually, although written orders said you need to keep Midway, he was actually to be more concerned about keeping the carriers if it came down to we can keep the carriers but lose Midway, or we can keep Midway but lose the carriers, he was to preserve the carriers. So yes, Nimitz does get some credit for the Battle of Midway because he's the one who took in the intelligence data and came up with the general plan of, I'm going to send, as it turned out eventually, 3 carriers down to fight the Japanese, with an approximate set of instructions as to how they were going to do that. So, of course, credit for the victory at Midway doesn't go to any one specific individual as a whole. Nimitz has a role, and down at the sharp end, of course, as we mentioned earlier, the pilots also have a role, because no matter what the senior officers do, if the pilots don't drop the bombs in such a way they actually hit the enemy ships, then everything else was for naught. So then we come down to the actual, if you like, again, at the sharp end, commanders on the scene, Fletcher and Spruance. Now, who came up again with these plans? Well, Fletcher, as the overall commander, is issuing more specific orders about what they're going to do and when. However, you've also got to bear in mind that Fletcher's addition to the task force is fairly last minute. Spruance was briefed almost as soon as he got back from the Doolittle raid on what was going on. Battle of Coral Sea was, of course, very recently fought, and Yorktown was limping her way back to Pearl Harbor. Yorktown then went into dry dock for emergency repairs. However, although Nimitz did order Yorktown to be made ready to sail on the 30th, at the time that she actually showed up on the 28th, and thus by the time Spruance leaves on the 29th, he knows that Fletcher has been ordered to sail with Yorktown. That doesn't strictly mean that Yorktown was going to join them. Nimitz has a damaged carrier come in, and he says, right, you have 3 days, or parts of 3 days, to bring it back up to full operational status, or at least operational status enough to make it to Midway and contribute meaningfully. Much as, Captain Kirk or Captain Picard might tell Scotty or Geordie LaForge, we need mains power back to the warp core in 30 minutes. But unfortunately, real life isn't like Star Trek. Just because an admiral has said fix this carrier in 72 hours doesn't necessarily mean the carrier will be fixed in 72 hours. They've still got to actually go in there and figure out what's gone wrong. How can we replace the bits that need to be replaced? How can we patch up things that need to be patched up? So when Spruance sails on the 29th, he knows there is a not inconsiderable chance that he might be the only task force that's heading down there. Or, if the repairs to Yorktown do occur and get her sail-worthy before Midway occurs as a battle, they might run past when Nimitz says they should sail, at which point Yorktown might take considerably longer to catch up than it did historically. And so Spruance, not being an idiot, is going to come up with plans of attack for Midway. Moreover, even once Fletcher catches up, although Fletcher is in overall command and will give people, again, the general idea of what's going to happen, when he wants people to attack, who he wants to run searches, etc., etc., the simple fact of the matter is that with the way US task forces worked at that point, Fletcher can say, I want to attack at X time using X ships, but how exactly those ships execute that attack is still down to the officers on the scene, which in this case would be Spruance and his staff for Task Force 16. Of course, Fletcher's orders to Task Force 17 would be much more directly carried out by his own staff. And so, while he's on his journey to Midway, Spruance has to come up with both general operational plans just in case Fletcher can't make it or can't make it in time, but also has to come up with specific plans about how Task Force 16 is going to undertake its attacks, regardless of whether he's ordering them from a position of being in command of all the US forces present, or from a position of Admiral Fletcher has directed him to a given position and then told him to initiate his attacks. So, for example, in the lead-up to the Battle of Midway, on different days you have different carriers launching air searches. Hornet and Enterprise both have their assigned day where some of their Dauntlesses are being used in the scouting role. It just so happens that on the day of the Battle of Midway, having had Hornet and Enterprise have their days on search duty, it's now Yorktown's turn. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit as to, who's planning what in the overall battle. So then we get to actually enacting those plans against the Japanese. So when the initial sighting of a pair of Japanese carriers is made, Fletcher gives the order to attack the enemy carriers as soon as definitely located, and then he says, well, yeah, and I'm going to come along once I've recovered my search planes. So in one way, Fletcher is giving the attack order, but Fletcher is not telling Spruance to immediately launch the attack. He's not saying, I want those aircraft off of your flight decks right this instant. What he's saying is, look, we've got an initial report of the enemy carriers. As soon as we know exactly where they are, I want you to attack them. But then it's up to Spruance to work out how that is going to be carried out. So he has to give the order to Task Force 16 when they're going to launch, with what and how. Because, of course, if the Japanese carriers are then definitively located, they could, in theory, be in almost any position. So if the report comes in and they say, oh, okay, right, we know where the Japanese carriers are relative to Midway, and therefore, because Spruance knows where his carriers are relative to Midway, he can work out where the Japanese carriers are relative to him. But if that positioning turns out to be that, oh, well, actually the Japanese carriers are 350, 400 miles away from his carriers, just because Fletcher has said immediately attack the carriers upon their definitive location, doesn't mean he's going to then blindly turn around and say, oh, well, Fletcher said attack, therefore we attack, because if the Japanese carriers are 400 miles away, at best, he's sending his entire air complement off on a suicide mission. At worst, they find nothing because of, errors in navigation, or their air search just doesn't find the Japanese carriers because they move in the time it takes them to travel that 400 miles. And he's still out all his aircraft just with nothing to show for it. Hence why you have this whole scramble once the carriers are located aboard Enterprise for his staff, and then Spruance himself with his maneuver board, working out where exactly everybody is in relation to everybody else, and thus enabling Spruance to then take Fletcher's more general order to attack once the aircraft carriers of the enemy have been located, obviously with the underlying context of if it is physically possible to do so, and then translate that into, right, we are now actually attacking in this manner, i.e. we're launching these aircraft at this time. And then, of course, while the aircraft are still rumbling off the flight decks, Spruance, realizing this is taking far too long and burning too much fuel, he also then makes the decision, right, you lot head off now, and we'll send the torpedo bombers after you. Now, of course, at the same time as all of this is going on, Fletcher and his staff are issuing completely different sets of orders to Yorktown, because Yorktown has to recover the search aircraft she sent out earlier and then prepare her own strikes, which will, of course, go out, and thanks to a bit of luck, obviously, the dive bombers from Yorktown and the dive bombers from Enterprise will arrive at the same time, despite launching at very different times. In some ways, this sort of parallels the position of Nelson and Collingwood at Trafalgar, and I will probably make reference to the similarities later on in the video as well, in that Nelson is in overall command of the fleet, and he has told the fleet how he wants to proceed to attack the enemy. But when battle is actually joined, of course, Nelson is in charge of his column, analogous to Fletcher aboard Task Force 17, and Collingwood is in command of his column, analogous to Spruance and Task Force 16. And ironically enough, it's Collingwood, aka Spruance, the overall notional subordinate, who actually gets into action first, with Royal Sovereign taking on Santa Ana, and of course Task Force 16 launching their aircraft first to attack the Kido Butai. So just as at Trafalgar, Nelson has given the order to attack, but exactly which ship the Royal Sovereign engages, and where in the line it cuts through, and the conduct of the column that's immediately following Royal Sovereign, all of that is very much down to Collingwood. So that's Collingwood's planning and orders are affecting the battle just as much as Nelson's are. Hence why I think it's justified, both in specifically this video and in overall context, to give Spruance a fair degree of credit for what happened at the Battle of Midway, although, to be fair, also not diminishing Fletcher, because, as we said, Fletcher is the one who's come up with the slightly broader overall plan. He's the one who's told Spruance when and where to go and what he wants him to do. And at the end of the day, also, Yorktown's dive bombers were just as critical at killing Kido-Butai aircraft carriers as Enterprises were, while Hornets went off and had themselves a little sojourn. So, there's that as well. And then we come down to the command element. So this is probably where perhaps there's the more thorny disagreement, because once Yorktown's out of action, I start to refer to Spruance as both considering and notionally commanding 3 carriers, as opposed to just Enterprise and Hornet, which obviously are 2. And I think this highlights the slight differences at times, especially in action, between formal and practical operational command. And of course, again, being in the video that I'm speaking from Spruance's perspective, I'm focusing more, especially with Midway, on the practical operational command that's going on at the time, rather than the notional rankings in order of battle charts. Now, of course, it's fairly obvious that when Yorktown is disabled for the first time and Fletcher is incapable of communicating with anybody because, well, there's a massive socking great fire and everybody has to concentrate on that, that much like, let's say, again with Trafalgar, when Nelson is shot, he is not yet dead, but he is incapacitated. He can't give immediate orders. Likewise, luckily, obviously, Fletcher was not fatally wounded, but he was out of communication with the rest of his fleet. And so at that point, Nelson is notionally still in command of the whole fleet because he is the senior officer present. He's been appointed to command the fleet and he is still alive. However, from the time Nelson is carried below, apart from very occasionally giving suggestions or and the odd order, mostly asking for updates, to be fair, the Battle of Trafalgar from that stage onwards is pretty much Collingwood's ball game, because now he has to make the decisions for the big things that are going to happen subsequently. And likewise now Spruance is left to make the big decisions, because a few hours after, well, a couple of hours actually, after Yorktown is initially hit and gets herself back up to speed, she's hit again much harder. And so when aircraft start coming back, Enterprise and Hornet are also recovering Yorktown aircraft. At this point, Spruance is effectively in command of the operation because he is the senior most officer present who is capable of acting effectively against the enemy. And of course, he now has to make the big decisions. How and when do we find and attack Hiryu? What do we do overnight? And so on and so forth. So he is effectively acting as the overall commander of the entire force, even if the orders of battle say that Fletcher is technically still in command. And of course, later on in the day, as mentioned in the video, when Fletcher manages to reach the Astoria and can finally talk to somebody, he sends a signal saying that he will conform to the movements of Spruance. Now, whilst, yes, Fletcher is not formally saying, I, Admiral Fletcher, cede command of the entire US fleet at sea in this battle to you, Admiral Spruance, forever and ever, amen, he is effectively saying that. He still has the right to reassert command at any point because he is the overall commander on paper, but you have to bear in mind that actually a signal like "we will conform to your movements" has a very long naval history, going all the way back into the Age of Sail. Back then, of course, everything is done by the Mark I human eyeball, and the best intelligence that you're likely to get is going to be from someone up in a crow's nest on a ship. Potentially, later on in the Age of Sail, with the advent of more complicated signalling, that could be someone in the crow's nest of a frigate. But for a lot of the Age of Sail, that would be whoever is up the crow's nest of a flagship. And but bear in mind, obviously, at that point, you can have multiple flagships because you have multiple admirals flying their flags, or potentially from a nearby vessel. And they are going to relay intelligence down to the admiral who's on a given ship, and they will then give orders as to how to maneuver to engage the enemy. If somebody says, right, we are going to conform to that ship's movements, that ship is in charge. That ship is going to lead the fleet, for better or worse, wherever it's going to go. So while you might have a lord or a count or a marquis or full admiral somewhere in the fleet, if that ship then signals actually conform to the movements of this other ship, which might just have a captain or a rear admiral or something like that aboard, well, it's the ship that everybody is conforming to the movements to that is now leading the entire fleet formation, despite obviously, of course, the senior officer technically having the right to reassert command at any point. And that general principle has, carried forward through navies for a very, very long time, bearing in mind that, World War II is pretty much the first time when a ship can reliably have other means other than human spotting to direct its attack profiles with, signals intelligence and radar and so forth. There's a limited amount of that in World War I with direction finding and radio communication from outrunning destroyers and so forth. But it's a lot more limited than in the Second World War. And, in a grand battleship line of engagement, again, signaling we will conform to your movements pretty much cedes operational command to whoever is then now directing the movements of the fleet. So yes, Fletcher is still in command of Task Force 17, and on paper, he is the overall commander of the fleet as a whole. But from the moment he signals from Astoria, we will conform to your movements, until such time as Fletcher signals otherwise, he is effectively handing command and control of the battle as a whole, without any further interference from him, to Spruance. And that means that Spruance, while he is obviously operating primarily with Task Force 16, does have to consider the overall picture of the battle that he's now in charge of, and that means also considering what may or may not happen to Yorktown. Hence why in the latter stages of the battle, I'm referring to him thinking about all three carriers and relating it as, do we turn this 4-1 score or 3-1 score into 4-1, or do we go with 4-3, which is obviously quite bad, and so on and so forth. It's not that Spruance has been formally elevated in the long term to command of all the US ships present, but from a practical perspective, at that point, he effectively is in that role, and he has to take consideration of all those ships. Because otherwise, the alternative is, well, he's only got to think about Task Force 16. He can completely ignore what happens to Task Force 17 because, hey, that's Fletcher's responsibility. And, well, yeah, that's not how any sane naval officer is going to act. So it is a very fine difference in that, yes, Spruance is not directly in command of Fletcher and Task Force 17, specifically, obviously, Yorktown, but he is having to very closely factor that task force and its ships into his overall calculations in a way that he wouldn't have had to do previously when Yorktown was fully operational and Fletcher was in overall command, because at that point, as with the initial part of the battle, Fletcher could just say, you go and do this, and he could go and do that, and what exactly was going to happen to Yorktown was not his problem, that was Fletcher's problem. Now, of course, this does also bring up another comparison between Nelson and Collingwood, because Trafalgar is traditionally held to obviously be Nelson's victory. Both literally he was aboard Victory and he won the battle, despite the fact that for a good chunk of the battle, Nelson was incapacitated, and in the latter stages, he was also dead, which was a bit of an inconvenience for, being in overall command. And so, as we said earlier, Collingwood was in charge of significant portions of the Battle of Trafalgar. Now, as we also covered, Fletcher was not dead, but the fact that he gave this order, we will conform to your movements, and then didn't try to arbitrarily and randomly reassert command during the subsequent days when you had the chase of the Japanese cruisers and so forth, doesn't mean that Fletcher doesn't get credit for what happened alongside, obviously, Spruance, because, of course, one, Fletcher gave that order in the first place, which was an incredibly responsible thing for him to do because he realized he couldn't command a battle like the one that was playing out from the Astoria. There are quite a number of other flag officers I can think of over the years who would have given it a try and potentially ruined things. But also, he then continued to not reassert his command. So at any point along that line, he could have stepped in and said, actually, you know what, Spruance, I'll take it from here. He could even have ordered Astoria to chase down Enterprise and Hornet, boarded Enterprise, and gone, right, now I'm going to take over aboard the carrier and take over your staff or bring my staff with me or whatever. Again, I can think of a few flag officers who would have tried that, but again, Fletcher didn't. He trusted Spruance enough to let Spruance get on with the job. And that in and of itself is the mark of a great commander, and someone who therefore obviously deserves a significant amount of credit for what has gone on. Much in the same way that we give Nelson the credit for Trafalgar, despite the fact that most of Trafalgar was fought by his subordinates, because Nelson had trained his subordinates and trusted them enough to let them get on with it, rather than, sitting around on deck of Victory, or even trying to micromanage the battle from the orlop deck of Victory while he was still conscious and capable of doing so. So hopefully that clears up a little bit for everyone why I presented that video the way I did, and some of the finer details, at least from the way I perceive things, as to how and where command falls relative between, formal command and practical operational command, and thus why I used the terms I did when I did during that very brief mention of the Battle of Midway as part of the overall element of Admiral Spruance's career. And once again, to cap it off with the fact that, I'm not trying to say that Spruance is the one who won Midway and we should all ignore Fletcher, or Nimitz, or McCluskey, or any of the others who were vital to the battle. What I'm saying in the video, and obviously here and now as well, is that, of course, Midway, as with all large-scale naval battles, is something of a team effort, and there's enough credit to go around for everyone. Did Fletcher win Midway? Yes, he did, by his various orders and actions, and in some cases, as we mentioned just a minute ago, his lack of actions. Did Spruance win Midway? Technically also yes, in that he gave the final orders for the attack, and he took over and ensured that Hiryu was destroyed, and followed up by, sinking Mikuma, and so on and so forth. And very importantly, keeping the fleet alive overnight when some other commanders might have proceeded west and ruined everything. Nimitz obviously also gets credit for winning Midway, because he's the one who put everything together, hit these particular two admirals in charge of their respective task forces, and sent them out there with enough intelligence for them to make their plans in the first place. And of course, the various pilots, including McCluskey and so forth, all get credit because, as we said earlier, at the end of the day, regardless of all the rest of it, if they didn't put their bombs on Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, we would be talking about a very, very different battle. And so, thanks very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this. Hope it clarified a few things. If you disagree with anything I said, or you want to clarify your own position on something, or you just want to add more observations, obviously please feel free to do so in the comments below. We had a really nice discussion in the previous comments, so hopefully that can continue here. But I thought it would just be important to put the reasons why I said what I did in this format here, so that people can understand in a little bit more depth that, no, I'm not trying to erase Fletcher, and also, no, I'm not trying to retell the entirety of Midway in 15 minutes. So for Friday videos at least, see you in a couple of weeks, where we'll be talking about what happened to all the different frigates involved in the frigate duels of the War of 1812, which is the one I was going to put up now, but oh well, just another couple of weeks until then.